So we're going to talk about vocational tests, a little bit about their history and some of the theory behind them and why we'd use these. So for the most part, a lot of current use of vocational tests is more about self-exploration. So giving people some information, especially as they're finishing high school, considering college, or considering other career paths, an idea of what careers might actually do well for them. So we see vocational tests a lot in career counseling, for instance. They are still sometimes used for actually sorting people post-hire. The U.S. military's ASVAB is a good example of that, where dependent on your vocational interests, based on some testing, you may be actually directed towards a particular career path. So let's talk a little bit more about them, kind of what makes them both similar to other measures we've discussed and different, and also kind of their history and how they're used today. So traditional approaches include the origin of the scale. So basically, origin of the scale can include criterion keying. If you'll remember, criterion keying means that basically just any type of question can be acceptable. It doesn't have to have face validity. In fact, a lot of times with criterion keying methods, what will happen is we'll have thousands of questions, and then we'll just give that to people that actually have those careers. And we'll look to see, is there a pattern? For example, do accountants tend to always endorse particular questions? So we might look at, like, for example, for accountants, of the hundreds or thousands of questions we gave them, what are the 13 or 14 that almost all accountants agreed with? That would then be indicated that those are items that determine that you'd probably be a good fit for accounting. So that's not theory driven, that's not face validity driven. And again, face validity means that it looks like what it measures. So for example, a face valid question about accounting would be, I really like looking at numbers and I can't stand to see a mistake. Those would be two examples of a face valid question that might indicate you might be a good accountant. A criterion keying, however, might be, I really enjoy the works of the author Douglas Adams. It doesn't matter if it makes face valid sense. All that matters is the criterion, being accountant, was keyed to that item. All accountants tend to agree with that item. Now, I actually don't know for a fact that that actually is an example. And a lot of criterion keyed items may also have face validity, but they don't always. The second type of origin scales is more of taking broad areas. So basically, logically or theoretically thinking about what are the environments, work places, work tasks that are involved with the job, and what kind of personalities, based on personality theory, would be a good fit. And then we try to categorize people into broad areas of interest. And a lot of modern vocational tests fall into this broad areas category. The other one can be item format, so absolute level of interest versus relative level of interest. So absolute level of interest basically is going to assign a score that for each particular trait or behavior that is associated with that particular field or preference, you have an absolute score, and that score is not dependent on any other scores. So for example, if you actually endorsed every single item on a test highly, you might actually score highly in every particular career. That'd be an absolute level of interest. Generally, this doesn't happen. We all have our preferences. We find those differences. And generally, if I had someone that took a test with an absolute level of interest and scored maximum score on every single subcategory, I would question whether that person had responded accurately and had understood the instructions. However, that doesn't mean it's impossible. A relative level of interest means that every single item is relative to everything else. In other words, you're having to choose, I prefer this item over that item, which means that you can't get maximum scores on all categories, because if one category is high, by its nature, there's going to be a matching category that is probably going to be low. This is going to make more sense as we go through some more examples. But again, most tests, at least modern vocational tests, tend to be based on theory in broad areas, less on criterion keying, so higher face validity, and are generally focused on a relative level of interest. In other words, you'll have some high scores and some lower scores. So just some quick example of absolute versus relative level of interest. An absolute level, rate the extent to which you like each of these items. So dissecting frogs, like, neutral, dislike. Analyzing data, like, neutral, dislike. Selling magazines, like, neutral, dislike. In this case, notice that you could just simply like all of these. You could like dissecting, you could like data, you could like cells. You can basically have high scores on everything. Relative scores, though, are among these activities mark either M for something you would like most, or L for something you would like least, or no mark if it really doesn't resonate with you one way or the other. So in this case, if I actually said I really like dissecting frogs, I made no response on analyzing data, and I made no response on selling magazines, I would only have a higher score in dissecting frogs. A lot of times we'll also see on relative levels that you actually have to choose one. So it might be between dissecting frogs and analyzing data, which would you prefer to do? That'd be another example of a way to get at relative levels. So again, generally speaking, with these levels, we're getting both high level and low level scores in the way that we're actually having people respond. So what's the need for vocational and interest testing? Interest testing represents an aspect of personality. So vocational tests don't actually tell us, can you do the job? You may have a strong interest or a strong personality that would imply that you would be a very good surgeon, but you may actually hate the idea of being around blood or wounds. You may actually be told that, through a vocational test that you'd make a really good carpenter, but you know for a fact that every time you've tried to build something, it's absolutely collapsed, that you have a tendency to be injury prone or accident, and it's just accident prone, and it's just not a good fit. So the first thing we need to really recognize is that vocational tests are more about a personality test, about is your personality in line with this particular path or career paths? So do you have a strong inclination to enjoy that work and to be successful in that work, assuming that you have the skills? It does not test the skills. So values and interests are related to life choices. We definitely do make some very big life choices based on our values and our interests. And most interest inventories are used to evaluate occupational interest and compatibility. So again, think about person, environment, fit. This is basically asking if you are a good fit for a particular role based on your personality, not necessarily your skill. So again, you may still fail if you try to do something. So a vocational test might say that you'd be a really good second grade teacher, but you hate kids. Now, if you truly hated kids, you probably wouldn't get that score on a vocational test, because some of it would be, I really like to work with kids, for instance, would be an item that you might have to score. But it would at least indicate at that point that you have an inclination to this one direction or another. So vocational tests are generally based on the types of work activities, not necessarily, again, whether you can do them, but whether you'd enjoy them, the work environment. So for example, we have two examples here. We have someone who is a soldier and someone who's a grade school teacher. One of them is probably primarily going to work indoors and probably in a heat or air conditioned controlled facility with children. The other one is much more likely to be a high risk position that's working outdoors and having to be outside a lot of the times. So some of the questions that might have directed that you are a good fit for one or the other isn't just the type of activity, imposing order versus controlling children, but it might also be the type of work environment. Do you enjoy being indoors with high control, or do you enjoy being outdoors in an ambiguous situation? It might also include questions about education and skill qualifications. So not necessarily whether you have the skills, but whether you are inclined to pursue them. So for instance, if a few questions might be, is college a part of my plans? Or do you enjoy going and learning more things? Do you enjoy structured education? If the answer was no, that might actually send you more towards a path as a soldier versus a path that requires a bachelor's degree, for example, higher education or working with kids. And then personal characteristics that match current workers in the field. So are your personality traits similar to someone who is already successful and enjoys that work? So the history of vocational tests have been used since the 1920s. Recent advances in vocational tests include more of a focus on self-exploration. So initially, these tests were almost trying to be used like mini assessments to basically determine what someone would do at their life, and would often even sometimes be used as a part of a selection process. You would apply for a job, for example, as a plumber. They might give you a vocational interest test. If the vocational interest test said that you wouldn't be a good plumber, they wouldn't hire you. We don't see a lot of that anymore because a lot of people recognize that vocational tests are more about self-exploration and learning about what we would enjoy than necessarily being a good predictor of whether we would be successful in a job. Because again, they don't measure skills. And there are some people that their vocational interests are not necessarily in line with what they choose to do in their lives. So that is also a factor that we want to include, and we want to make sure that we're not using a test which doesn't have a direct relationship to the job performance when we're doing assessment. We have seen differences in how the tests are normed for men and women and also other protected groups within the United States. So there's been a lot of effort to make sure that vocational tests are bias-free or as free from bias as possible. So again, you can think of if a vocational test was written in the 1920s, a lot of professions were almost exclusively held by men, which means that a lot of the items would probably not have been written in such a way that a woman would endorse them, which would then further support that women shouldn't be in these careers. And finally, a lot of modern tests, of course, are constantly being updated to include all of the career options that are available as we get into an increasingly complex world. So current uses of vocational tests include assisting in career counseling. That's probably one of the biggest uses. Assisting in selecting college majors. So there's quite a few programs out there where they will use this as one of their tools to kind of indicate potentially a college major. And I strongly encourage you to take the various assessments. There's one available in this module that's online. There's also one you can simply just download and take pen and paper and get a score and see if you are actually in line with where you're planning to go with your career, dependent on your major and dependent on what you're planning to do with the major. I'm a big believer that college majors should lead you to a greater path, that they're a stepping stone on your way to a career that fits you. And vocational tests often are a good way of indicating some interest in is this a very good fit for you? And finally, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, the ASVAB is used in military position placement. It's not the only thing being used, but again, if you show a strong aptitude towards engineering, then you're likely to end up pushed in a direction that would include engineering. If you have a strong inclination towards communication, intelligence gathering, mechanical work, all of those are going to start to indicate what specific skill sets the Army wants to focus on as they train you. So let's talk about a couple of the big theories, if you will, and kind of structures of most vocational tests. Probably one of the biggest is Holland's hexagonal model of general occupational themes. Most vocational tests, especially modern tests, incorporate these 6 basic themes. It's been highly supported by both research and actual practical use. It's highly face valid. So basically, Holland suggests that all of us have basically that all jobs, all careers can be broken down into 6 broad themes. There's R, or realistic, hands-on, building, repairing, mechanic, electrician, farmer. It's someone that actually does something. That doesn't mean they necessarily design something. That means they enjoy the process of actually physically interacting with tools. Investigative, task-oriented, research, and scholarly. Biologist, chemist, experimental psychologist, but also to some degree, policing, detective work. All of these would be investigative. Journalism might be in this category too. So it's easy to think about this in an academic setting, kind of a scholarly setting, but it is actually wanting to go through a systematic process of research in order to complete tasks. Artistic, creating and appreciating art, including interior design, painting, play directing. So basically anything that involves actually the creative generation of content. Social, socially competent, likes helping people, teacher, counseling, human services. Enterprising, leading with selling skills, manager, salesman. And conventional, traditional, structured, orderly, bank teller, data processing, accountant. And you can see some of these kind of play into each other. Some of them are actually somewhat counter from each other. And that's one of the other ideas, is that Holland's hexagonal model also includes diametrically opposed and similar traits. So for example, artistic and social and enterprising may be connected for some people. And also when you take this test, you're not given a single score, you're usually given your top 3 scores. So here's an example of that hexagon. So again, we see that social and artistic are connected Artistic and investigative is connected. Investigative and realistic is connected. Realistic and conventional is connected. Conventional and enterprising is connected. And enterprising is connected to social. Realistic and social, the doers versus the helpers, are somewhat counter. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't have those as your top two scores. It just means they're a little less likely. People typically kind of follow the path. For example, I am actually an IRC, investigative, realistic, and conventional. I have a very good friend who is a musician. It is probably more an ASE, artistic, social, and enterprising. Investigative and enterprising are somewhat counter to each other. Conventional versus artistic are a little bit counter as well. So this kind of just gives a framework for thinking about it, but it's important to recognize that the framework doesn't mean you can't be an I and an E, and the framework is more of just kind of giving us an idea of various careers. And another resource available in the module is a quick download. It's about a 6-page PDF that includes most of the modern jobs that fall under these 6 categories. So just briefly in summary, John Holland's hexagonal model of general occupational themes, each theme characterizes a type of person and a type of comfortable work environment. So it kind of gives us a general idea of, would you enjoy that work and would you enjoy working in that environment? People are not classified into a single type. They're usually classified by the top 3 in order. So an RA person is mainly realistic, but their next highest score is investigative, and the next highest score is artistic. So this is someone that really does prefer to be hands-on, but wants to solve problems and has some creativity. Now, if we flip these, they are artistic, investigative, and realistic. This is someone that very much enjoys being creative in their thinking, but they want to use that creativity to solve problems. But at the end of the day, they also like to be a little hands-on. So types are matched with professions, profiles for a landscape architect, for example. So again, if we actually look at connecting the RISIC model, so those 6 terms, those 6 letters, we also find that generally most careers don't fit under one of those 5 letters. They typically fall into a pattern, a profile of the top 3. Job recommendations are then based on similar profiles. So if you are an RIA, you would look at RIA jobs. But you might also take a look at IA jobs and other jobs out there that might interest you as well. But you probably wouldn't want to be looking at a model that doesn't have any of those. So if you are RIA, you probably wouldn't want to look at, for example, a entrepreneurial social position. That would probably not be a very good fit for you, all things considered. So a continuation of Holland's model is the strong interest inventory, and it has actually been around it was designed in E.K. Strong in 1927. However, it has gone through numerous massive revisions. It is probably one of the most scientifically supported vocational tests out there. The current scale has 291 items, and it's intended for ages 15 to adult. Includes interest questions based on preferences and occupations, school subjects, activities, leisure activities, and contacts with people. And it has some basic assumptions. Each occupation has a pattern of interest. Interests tend to be stable. That's one of the reasons it's not intended for people under the age of 15. And patterns can discriminate job preferences. So again, not whether you can do the job, but whether you'd be a good fit for the job. The SII, Strong Interest Inventory, has 3 types of questions. Statements categorized in a Likert scale. So making a speech, do you strongly agree that you'd like to do that, or you strongly disagree that you'd like to do that? So remember, a Likert scale is a 1 to 5 scale generally, with a strongly agree to strongly disagree. Do you strongly agree that you would like to live dangerously? So again, if you strongly agreed, that might nudge you towards more of a military career, for example. If you actually did not like to live dangerously, that might nudge you to an educational career. Express preferences between 2 categories, dealing with things versus dealing with people. So there are a series of questions that basically make you have to choose one over the other. And finally, a set of self-descriptors, where you're asked basically to describe yourself and your personality. And you get 3 levels of results. The first level is the Holland code. You get 6 general occupational themes that basically mirror Holland. Now, obviously, the original Strong Interest Inventory created in 1927 did not necessarily build on these 6 themes. But as I said, this has been revised constantly to keep up with modern trends in occupation. Beyond those 6 occupational themes, there's also 25 basic interest scales and 211 occupational scales that basically give you a much better picture of what you want to do. So unlike taking the Holland test, which will give you a broad list of potential careers, this test will give you that broad list, then will actually tell you your basic interest, and then finally will actually suggest specific occupations.